All right, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jake Ellsworth, and I'm joined here by Sean Riley and Carlo Hernandez, who will be covering IT consulting project pitfalls and how to ensure the perfect project. So before I hand things over to Sean and Carlo, I just wanted to give a quick intro to Covestic for those of you who may be new here. Covestic is a one-stop shop across the IT ecosystem, from projects to development to operations and staffing. Since our founding in 2001, we have completed over 300 successful ServiceNow projects, with 90% of our customers coming back for additional engagements. As practitioners, we implement, run, and offer a broad range of capabilities across IT, with our experience rooted in solving real-world challenges and helping you perform at the speed of business. All right, so now that you know a little bit about Covestic, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Sean and Carlo to introduce themselves and get into the good stuff.
Well, thank you very much, Jake. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sean Riley. I'm one of the senior engagement managers at Covestic. I have been in IT consulting for a little over 26 years. I have spent the last 2.5 years with Covestic. Prior to that, I've worked in large enterprise organizations doing everything from identity management. I've got some experience with Remedy. And then early in my career, I was focused on network operations centers, network operating center, and served in the United States military. So with that said, I'll hand the floor over to Carlo.
Hey, thanks, Sean. So, hey, everyone, Carlo Hernandez, I'm one of the engagement managers with Covestic. Been with Covestic for about 4 years now, but have been EMing ServiceNow projects for the better part of, I want to say 8 to 10 years. EMing projects, smaller projects from health assessments to integrations to larger scale, multi-year program implementation. So hopefully I can provide some insight into avoiding project pitfalls for you.
Thank you, Carlo. All right, everyone. So what we're going to do today for our agenda is we're going to focus in on 4 key stages of a project, right, or engaging in a project. And we're going to start off talking about engaging a vendor. All right, so this is going to be all of those prerequisite things that you'll want to consider. Then we'll talk about the discovery and project scoping, take a little bit of a dive into pre-sales, how to best prepare, how to set expectations, and then we'll jump into project delivery and talk about some of those critical activities that take place then. And then, as with all projects, we'll talk a little bit about change. So let's jump into talking about engaging a vendor. So this is how to best prepare prior to engaging your vendor. First thing we always recommend is that you sit down as a business and you document your business case and what your expected outcomes are. While doing this, we just keep referring to this as your vision. So really identify your goals and objectives, define what deems the project a success, socialize this with your various subject matter experts and key stakeholders, and then put together a core team that will sit down and document your use cases. One of the big value points of putting together those use cases is that they can be leveraged as part of your pre-sales cycle when you select your vendor, as well as during the actual project delivery stage to help guide the team as to what it is you're doing, how it needs to be done to actually be successful in your environment. You'll want to take some time to research your vendor. All right, do they have recent experience in delivering the desired solution that you're seeking? If they've previously been contracted by the organization, find out what the experience was like. Were they a true partner, or were they more of just a simple technical provider who provides folks that will take your direction and simply just develop based on what it is that you ask them to, right? Are they thought leaders? Those are the types of things that you would want to be looking for. Make sure you understand your budget. All right, this is going to really drive what any vendor can truly deliver to you, right? And that'll set expectations as far as overall scope. One of the other things that we always want you to pay, key attention to is committing staff to the project. The organization must be committed to providing the resources needed to complete the overall engagement. Failure to do so will understaff the project. It will certainly hurt you financially as well as your timeline. And then finally, one of the things that we talk about and recommend is considering training. So regardless of what you're implementing within the ServiceNow ecosystem, if there is foundational training available for it, we always recommend that you take that. This is going to serve you when you get into the workshops. It can even assist you with finalizing your use cases. All right, these are the things that you'll want to do in preparation. Carlo, was there anything that you'd like to add in that, or something that you've seen that you really want to call out?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So, obviously everything that you've identified is critical to the successful delivery of any project. And I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit. But from my perspective, I can tell you that's what's caused me the greatest number of headaches is the commitment to staffing the project as needed to achieve desired results. Now, obviously, I realize we're all busy, and as needed is a relative term. But once we have the project plan laid out and we know who we need to do what, when, it's important to have those resources available at those times. I can't tell you how many times we've come to a particular phase in a project or sprint and we need to have a specific resource, like a security admin or a network engineer, and they're unavailable due to either conflicting projects or whatever other constraints. But not having those resources when needed can bring the project to a screeching halt, right? Obviously impacting your schedule and budget, et cetera. So ensuring that we have that commitment of those resources, those teams, those team members, it's imperative to a successful project.
Great call out, sir. All right, so let's jump into discovery and project scoping. So far we've gone through, we've put together what our vision is, we've documented, our business cases, our outcomes. We've worked with the various folks in the organization to make sure that we have a full understanding of what it is that needs to be delivered. So now it's time to sit down with the vendor that you have selected, and or if you're looking to do an RFP, sitting down with several vendors. So this is where all of that hard work is going to pay off. So you're going to want to sit down with those folks and you're going to want to review that vision. Walk them through your use cases. Identify any challenges or constraints that you have. So those types of items could be anything from key dates that you can't afford to miss. There could be blackout periods. There could be licensing impacts. There could be several reasons as to why the timeline needs to be condensed, or at some stage during the project, there will be planned gaps. These are things that you're going to want to share with the vendor so that they understand how the project will need to be resourced. It will also help identify any particular risks early in the project phase to allow a proper mitigation strategy to be put in place. You're also going to want to describe to those vendors what is the business trying to solve and why. Again, tying that back to the vision. This just allows us to go a level deeper and be open on the time and effort that your people can dedicate to the project. As Carlo just mentioned, this is one of the huge pitfalls. If you don't have the right players in place, you end up repeating workshops, having critical folks miss workshops. Therefore, we have gaps in requirements and or folks that aren't fully familiar with what needs to be achieved or missing. And now we're working and going down a path that really doesn't achieve the desired results. Now, as you go through this process and you're conducting all of these discovery sessions with that vendor as they're trying to capture a statement of work, one thing that I encourage you to do is don't assume that just because it was discussed that it's going to be included in the overall project. All right. As mentioned before, budget is also one of those key items. Your budget may not allow for everything that's been discussed in that pre-sale cycle to be included within your statement of work. And or there's the potential that it simply got missed. All right. So you're going to want to make sure, review your statement of work closely and or proposal. If you have any questions, make sure that you reach back out to that vendor and say, hey, I don't see this particular item that we talked about. Is it covered? Is it included? And have them show you where, if for any reason you're not comfortable that the statement isn't clear, then simply ask that vendor to place it in there. And lastly, at the end, if it's a proposal and or that the SOW comes into play and budget becomes an issue, we highly recommend that you use a phased approach versus scaling back on required functionality. And what we're talking about here is, in some cases, we'll go into an organization where they have purchased multiple modules, process areas, whatever terminology you would like to use, to leverage within ServiceNow. It is better to go ahead and focus on one or two of those areas and get them to a level of maturity that actually benefits the organization, rather than trying to implement a little bit of everything across the board where it becomes a challenge for the organization. So yes, they can get some things done, but it's painful, right? But they can do painful exercises across 5 process areas versus smooth, efficient, everyone loves it, 2 process areas, go seamless. The latter is where you want to go, all right? Make sure that you focus in on required functionality and not necessarily just a breadth of development work. All right, so we've gone through our pre-sale cycle, we've got our statement of work in place, and now it's time for where the rubber meets the road, right? This is the stage where it's time for us all to stay focused, be open to new ideas, and of course, be transparent with everyone. When we begin a new project, at the beginning, what we like to do is make sure that we get the project sponsor involved, as they are the ones that set the tone. All right. We ask that as they stay engaged, that they revisit that vision often. And one of the key reasons for that, and areas that we can do this, is right at the front end. When we do the kickoff, we have them go through and review what their vision is, what the goals and objectives are, and why we're doing that. And most important, what do they deem as a successful project? You know, those 5 to 8 bullets that dictate, hey, if you achieve these things, this project or program will be deemed a success. That is what's most important to us. As we go through the life cycle of development, we'll have opportunities during sprints, retrospectives, and that type of thing for the sponsor to come in and maybe reiterate and revisit that vision. And then there would be additional opportunities. Carlo, I know that when you and I spoke, there's also some other areas in which you try to get the sponsor involved and or other folks.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like that, revisiting the vision often is listed so prominently here, because I feel like it's an important component, of any project that's often overlooked, right? And overlooked by way of either, revisiting them infrequently. To your point, we mentioned it in the front end of the project at the kickoff, but oftentimes I've seen it to kind of peter out or not revisit again until the end of the project, or doing so in a silo, right? We mentioned that the project sponsor sets the tone, but I like to make sure that we have the full project team involved in those, whatever we want to call them, revisiting meetings, to make sure that we're all in agreement and hearing the same message at the same time.
Good deal. All right, so moving on, and another key aspect is failure to plan properly is a plan. Failure to properly plan is a recipe for project failure. So one of the first stages of planning is really to set up a solid rules for engagement. You can think racy here. Really, ultimately, what we're looking for is, who are those decision makers going to be? All right, who are the folks that need to be consulted? So those are going to be your subject matter experts, and those people that need to be informed of what's going on. All right, so those are just some key aspects that we're looking for. Ensure that those people are made available. Again, we get back to making sure that the appropriate people are assigned to the project, and most importantly, that their time has been committed. When you're going through and putting together your timeline, we've got to make sure that it's realistic. All right, I can't tell you how many times we get into a situation where it could be the final quarter of the year. So, it's October is hit, and a client may need to have the new solution put in place and operational by January 1. All right. It was scoped from day one to be a 12-week project. Initially, the plan was to maybe get that project started, in September, but for whatever reason, some delays occurred. It could be just getting contracts signed, getting resources locked in, whatever the case may be. However, if we start a project off in October, we've only got a limit of 12 weeks to get everything completed. But as we all know, when we talk about that time of year, you've got Thanksgiving, you've got Christmas, you've got people both on the vendor side as well as on the client side that are taking PTO. This is going to include several key folks that must be present for us to be successful. So you're going to lose anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks given that time of year, which means now you're trying to condense 12 weeks worth of work down to 8 weeks. It's a recipe for disaster. So what needs to happen is that a mitigation plan would need to be put in place, and there's certain risks that would have to be accepted and or scale back. Again, the scope of what's going to be done, what gets you operational by January 1 or off that other software package as an example, so that you don't incur additional fees. And that way you can do all of the other additional enhancements into the new year. So again, it's just all about putting the strategy into place. Make sure that you understand and communicate other projects that may impact and or compete for resource time. All right. So I can't tell you how often, we run into situations where we're just getting into a project. Maybe we're just starting our first or second sprint. And then we receive a notification that, hey, by the way, we're getting ready to do our upgrade next week. This should have been identified probably during the project or even during initial planning before we even kicked off the project. The last thing that you want to do is do some type of major operation with ServiceNow, or in the event that you have a competing project. All right, so maybe you're implementing some new platform that's going to leverage some of those same resources. The determination needs to be made up front. What are the priorities, and or accept the risk that the timeline of your ServiceNow implementation could be extended. And again, I keep referring back to ServiceNow, but this really applies to any project. And lastly, and I've alluded to this, make sure that you have an agreed to mitigation strategy for all known project risks. All right, stick to the plan. Make sure that those are identified as early as possible so that there's just no surprises. So we've gone through our initial planning, and now we're ready to get into the true delivery phase, where we're going to get into doing workshops and that type of thing. So as we jump into this phase of the project, the first thing that we're going to look for is to have process owners identified. So these are the folks and or individual that will make key decisions. Each process should have its own owner. The last thing that we like to see, and it tends to cause confusion, is when you're trying to make decisions by committee. Ultimately, there should be one person that is responsible to make those decisions and sign off on those requirements. Key stakeholders and subject matter experts should participate as needed. At the front end, when we do our planning, one of the things that we'll do is provide you a full agenda of the various workshops that will take place and who should be involved. And we try to give you, reasonable guidance as to when certain individuals will be needed. All right, to do our best so that, again, you're efficient with the use of the resources time. As we're in these workshops, we want you to ask questions. All right? 2 key reasons for projects to fail early on as you're in those workshops is if you simply allow your vendor to drive the conversation, i.e. they're just telling you what you need to build and you're just going along for the ride. All right. In this case, you're liable to have a solution that really doesn't meet your business needs because you've just trusted that whatever the vendor tells you is exactly what you need. Ask questions. Make sure that you understand what it is that they're proposing. Conversely, if you have a vendor that allows you as the client to simply provide all of the requirements, tell them how they want it done, and they're not pushing back on certain things, right? Throughout this process, there should be some give and take. There should be, I always say when I'm doing my kickoffs, at some point we're going to bump heads, right? We're here, and what the value of a good vendor is to provide that thought leadership. They're there to tell you, hey, look, that's a good idea, it's a bad idea, here's the reason why, and then help align the implementation towards best practices, right? Keep you away from those pitfalls. If they simply do everything that you tell them to do, I guarantee you that's a recipe for disaster. As we capture these requirements, we're going to want to make sure that they get prioritized. All right, so here at Covestic, we kind of like to put things in a few buckets, and I'll give some definitions behind them. So MVP, this is what we call the minimal viable product, not maximum, but minimum. All right, these are the items that we're going to want to focus on that keeps the business running. So you can think of this as a replacement for your as-is state, i.e. how you do business today, right? We don't want to set you back. Next, we have those critical items. So these are the items that we need to focus on and that must be implemented in order to achieve our goals and objectives, i.e. what deems the project a success. All right. Now, I've seen in so many cases that we gather requirements and they say, well, all of it's important. All right. Well, it all may be important, but it's not all critical. All right. And if every requirement's critical, then nothing is critical, right? There's got to be some type of priorities. Then beyond that, we're going to get into items that are, say, a high priority. These are things that you would really like to have, and then moderate and low, right? Low being those items that, hey, if we can get them done, great. The world's not going to come crashing down on us if it doesn't get done. All right, when these requirements are captured and you're going to be expected to understand them as well as sign off on them, the requirements that do get documented and shared with the team, they should be well defined. There should be a clear definition of what done is. And what we mean here is the acceptance criteria that the work that has been delivered meets the business need. Requirements and proposed solutions should be based on required functionality and not the way it's currently done. This is where we're asking you to be open to new ideas. All right, there's a bunch of different ways to skin the cat, right? But at the end of the day, we've got the requirement, and our goal is to meet that requirement. In some cases, it may in fact need to be done a certain way. However, what we ask is that you be open as to how we get there, as long as we get there. Again, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're keeping in mind best practices, things that we've seen successful with other businesses. Requirements should focus on solving problems and improving efficiencies and not what ifs. All right. Recently had a situation in which we did a bunch of work, delivered it, was sitting in production, actually for a little over a month. We were still engaged with the client. We're still doing some work for them. Things are going great. And then we got a phone call that said, hey, we've got a situation now where we've had one person submit something that caused a bit of a hiccup. And so our response was, okay, well, let's take a look at it. And as we started getting into the conversation, the stakeholder that was involved started spiraling and saying, I can see this happening in the future. And then I asked the question, I said, well, how often has this happened in the past? Well, this is the first time it happened, but now that it's happened, I can see that this could be reoccurring. And we ended up spending several days going back and forth. And then about a week later, we all came to the conclusion that this really wasn't an issue. All right, so don't start circling the drain over what ifs. Focus in on that 80-20 rule. All right, so let's make sure that 20% of our effort or 20% of our effort really focuses in on 80% of what the business needs. All of the rest of our effort should be focused in on improving efficiency, enhancements, things of that nature, not focused in on what ifs, these things that happen once a month, once a quarter, biannually or annually, right? Can we provide a workaround? These are all the types of things that you should be considering before approving heavy development work for something that just may or may not happen. So we've gotten into our project, we're delivering against it, we're going through our sprint cycles, and as always, change is inevitable. All right, this is where more than ever we need to make sure that we stay focused on what our end goals are, that we don't start circling that drain. So all requests for changes, as they come in, they should be evaluated by the core project team. All right, and simply just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. Right? The first things that we should be asking ourselves, or some of those key questions, is, does it align with our overall vision? Right? And if the answer is no, it should probably simply just go into our backlog. Does it provide benefit to the organization? Now, the answer is, in many cases, some of these changes indeed add benefits. That's why they were brought up to the team. However, is the cost of adding this new functionality or making this change, does that level of work and financial cost outweigh, or does the benefit outweigh those costs, I should say, excuse me. So those are questions that we'll be asking ourselves. And then, is the change based on need or simply a cool feature or discovered capability? We see this all the time. They've gone through into some user group or something like that. They see a new capability, or maybe even as part of one of our reviews, a developer said, hey, by the way, one of the things you may want to consider in the future is to do X. And someone says, that's a great idea, I've got to have it. No, you don't, right? It's one of those things, it's cool to have. It wasn't part of our original set of requirements. So the reality is, in most cases, it should probably go to the backlog. But again, that's why we have that core team together, to evaluate, determine level of effort, and see how it fits into the overall picture. So with that said, not all changes are necessarily bad, right? But we want to make sure that we do avoid a few core things. One, seeking perfection, right? As you go through in a project, projects are designed to package a release that can be delivered to the organization that they can use operationally, right? I would like to think, and I know everyone wants an end solution that absolutely runs with perfection. There's no problems, there's no issues, and it solves world hunger, right? And no one's going to need any other changes to it. That's nirvana, never going to happen. So we like to save those components for continuous improvement, right? So sit down, think about what those items are, but again, stay focused on what was our goals at the beginning of the project. If we've addressed them, everything else goes to the backlog until after we get operational. Getting back to those new must-haves, right? A lot of these tend to be because they found out some new capability, right? Just because I can lock down a field, or just because I can automate something, or what have you, right? It doesn't matter. Doesn't mean it needs to be done today. If it didn't need to be done 6 months ago, it does not need to be done today. That should go to your backlog. Lastly, and this is probably the biggest one that affects all projects, and it just tends to creep its way in. All right, and this is those minor enhancements that are very small in nature. You'll hear people talk about low-hanging fruit and terms like that. These are easy, right? They're the type of requirements and enhancements that people present that a developer will say, it'll take me longer to document it than it will to develop it, right? That's at face value. The reality is, most requirements, regardless of how simple they are, can never be implemented in production, and or should not be implemented in production. That means it has to go through the full life cycle, right? We want to have it validated that, yes, this is indeed supposed to be implemented, number one. Two, we want to make sure that it's signed off and agreed to. We need to make sure that it doesn't impact anything else. And then it's got to go through testing, and then it's got to be moved to prod. Documentation could potentially need to be updated. So all of this does indeed take more time. But more importantly, as you start to get several of these, all right, I refer to this as a death by 1,000 cuts. Individually, no harm, no foul. But once you start to bring them all together, there is a huge impact to the timeline. There could be impacts to resources who now have to be made available to return back to the project, whether it be for testing, evaluation, what have you. And then there's just the timeline that could be impacted, or the overall cost, because the project now has run over because of these small items. And then because they weren't considered as a release 2, where we're considering how all of these various fixes can impact the work that's already done, in some cases there is the ability to break things. Carlo, I'm going to ask you, sir, to jump in, because I know that you've had, you've probably encountered several things within this area that you've seen cause just, havoc as you get into a project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sean. So, I mean, just quickly, I mean, I really want to emphasize the seeking perfection piece, right? I mean, you mentioned in your other slide about MVP, and it's not uncommon that as we go through the project and the day-to-day activities to deliver a project, we may lose sight of what the M stands for, right? It's not maximum, right? To Sean's point earlier, what can we deliver for this initial release so that we can get it to our users to begin using? Finally, once this releases in a while, and we can begin tackling some of those enhancements. But if we, try to bake every single requirement in, death by 1,000 cuts, and as they come up, that finish line gets further and further away. And then, we run the risk, and it's an extreme risk of that, but, we do run the risk of it potentially never getting released. So something to be mindful of.
Thank you, sir. Great input. All right, folks. So look, this is really, again, at a high level, those items that we wanted to cover with you. We would love the opportunity to work with you. So if you're interested, make sure that you reach out to Covestic. We've got our contact information here. And Jake,